Okay, well, hi and welcome everyone. This is the UC Center Sacramento Speaker Series. This is the third talk of our fall season, and the first one to tackle the theme of adapting to a drier, hotter California. The Center's other two Speaker Series themes for 2022-23 are creating a resilient public health system and addressing chronic homelessness and mental illness. Next week, we'll be hearing from UC Davis water expert Jay Lund on drought, uncertainty, and the future of water for California. And the following week from UCLA School of Public Health Dean Ron Brookmeyer on protecting public health through data, models, and policy. These two upcoming talks will be presented in hybrid format, both in person at 1130 K Street and by Zoom. UCCS is able to bring you these presentations with the support of the University of California and its 10 campuses, but we're also grateful to have had a number of organizational and private sponsors over the years. Today, we gratefully acknowledge the co-sponsorship of the Center for California Real Estate, which is an affiliate of the California Association of Realtors. CAR will be sponsoring two additional talks this academic year, including a session later this quarter featuring Berkeley professor Carolina Reed on California's housing crisis, policies for a more affordable, equitable, and sustainable housing future. I know that many association members are in attendance today, and to you, we say both welcome and thank you. Now, back to today's program. California housing is unprepared for extreme heat today, not to mention future increases in duration and intensity expected under climate change. Given these realities, how can we protect Californians where they live? It's going to get hotter. What can we do to protect ourselves and the most vulnerable in California as the climate changes? Well, here to address these issues with us is Professor V. Kelly Turner. Professor Turner is Associate Professor of Urban Planning and Geography at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Policy. Her research addresses the relationship between institutions, urban design, and the environment. The author of many academic and policy-oriented publications, whose work is funded by the National Science Foundation, among others, she earned a BA in political science from Wellesley College and received a PhD in geography from Arizona State University. She also presented related work in a special UCCS legislative briefing last February. Just a word about questions, because of our Zoom format, we'll be taking questions through the Q&A button in chat. So please type in your questions at any time during the session, and we will moderate and take them towards the end. So now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Kelly Turner. Professor Turner, welcome.
Great, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you so much for having me here. As you mentioned, I'm a faculty in urban planning and geography, but I also wear a hat as the co-director of the Luskin Center for Innovation, which I will explain here in just a moment. And today's talk is going to be focused on extreme heat in homes, but we have a broader research program on extreme heat at the Luskin Center that I'm going to flag for you all. I'm really happy to have a lot of folks from real estate in attendance. One, because it goes back to a former life in which I did do quite a bit of interviewing of real estate and development types, but also because we feel at Luskin Center that housing issues are climate issues and climate issues are housing issues. And so to address one without the other is to not to be fully prepared for the future. So the Luskin Center for Innovation, for those who are not familiar, is a research center housed in the School of Public Affairs at UCLA. And our mission is to unite scholars with civic leaders to solve environmental challenges confronting California communities, the nation, and the world. So while most of our work has been focused on California, and today's research will be focused on California, we're increasingly looking beyond the state to make connections from federal, state to local communities. And in today's talk, I'm going to start by briefly giving an overview about why Luskin Center has chosen to focus on heat and its governance as one of two of our main action items. Right now we're focused on heat and climate adaptation, and then also we have a secondary interest in water governance and infrastructure. And so I'm gonna lay that out very briefly, some sort of 101s of heat in California, and then what can be done to protect people where they live is going to be the bulk of this presentation, and focused primarily on a recent policy brief that we have released at the center, which is available online, and you'll also be able to find a link at the end of my talk. Okay, heat is a multifaceted problem. One thing that's gotten a lot of play recently in the news, and you may have heard this statistic, but heat is a leading climate hazard. It contributes to more fatalities than all other weather-related disasters combined in the United States. And that's based on really modest estimates. Individual communities have done estimates at sort of the city level and found orders of magnitude higher mortalities, not to mention heat illness. And one of the reasons why heat is so difficult to it's so difficult to put a number on heat fatalities is because it often is a comorbidity with other issues. So if you already have some sort of underlying or pre-existing condition, heat stress will exacerbate that and make it potentially deadly. So mortality estimates we know are high, and we know that they're severely undercounted. Heat is also a land management challenge. So while we can't directly augment the climate patterns that are contributing to weather changes that are making heat, extreme heat more severe and more frequent, into heat season, extreme heat season longer, we can control the built environment in cities and make that both to mitigate the urban heat island, but also to adapt to heat stress in communities where people live and work. And so at a regional scale, we can speak about this urban heat island effect, which many of you may have heard now. It's, maybe 5 years ago, this was not part of sort of popular lexicon, but increasingly it is, which is good. But I just wanted to clarify for everyone in attendance that the urban heat island is a really specific term, and it refers to the phenomenon that built materials and anthropogenic activities in cities tend to make cities a little bit hotter than undeveloped areas that are sort of proximate. It's a regional metric. It's only meant to describe regions. So it would not be appropriate to talk about the urban heat island, say in local communities or at the scale of an individual site, say if you were developing that site. And that's important because the urban heat island is primarily controlled by surface materials, by impervious surface, by the lack of vegetation. If we care about zooming down sort of to the middle scale, neighborhood to neighborhood, what causes places like Los Angeles, where I live, one community to be way cooler than another community? It's not the urban heat island, it's something we call local climate zones. And that's the three-dimensional morphology of the community. So if you go to, say, Beverly Hills or Bel Air, some of the areas that are adjacent to UCLA, you get high tree cover, you get sort of the surfaces that you would expect, but also you get a three-dimensional morphology in terms of building heights that cast shadows, and that all kind of combines to create airflow and makes those communities much cooler than, say, if you're in the San Fernando Valley and you have this sort of spread out single-story lack of tree canopy cover. So we're talking about the holistic sort of neighborhood context. So that's relevant in terms of land planning and housing, and thinking about how our housing stock is contributing to the neighborhood heating and cooling situation. And then zooming down even further, we can talk about the human body, heat stress, the thermal burden that's placed on individuals when they are outside. And this is primarily controlled by shades. So protecting people from direct sun exposure and the surfaces that they stand on or near from sun exposure, so that those surfaces don't re-radiate heat back at them. That is how we reduce the thermal burden on an individual. And that can change in a matter of feet. 3 feet away could be much shadier and much cooler than just right adjacent to that spot. Another concern for us about extreme heat and why we think this should be a priority is that it is a climate justice issue. This here was a well-published, a publicized study. It showed up in the New York Times. You may have seen this. There's an interactive map. And this is showing that places that have been historically redlined tend to be hotter, and that's because of a disinvestment in green infrastructure by and large, and an overinvestment in impervious surfaces. And so we can see sort of a trend in which we have communities that are already potentially heat vulnerable because of lack of access to things like adaptive strategies for heat, air conditioning, swimming pools, shade, but also we're creating communities that are hotter for them in the first place. So they're sort of getting hit on both ends of the spectrum. Another reason why we want to focus on heat and especially heat governance is that heat governance is very much in its infancy. So we did a study where we looked at over 170 municipal planning documents from the 50 most populous cities in the United States. These were general plans, infrastructure plans, hazard plans, sustainability plans, and so on. And we looked at what cities are doing for heat. And while most of the cities did mention heat, substantive clauses that considered action were fewer. And most of the plans were centering trees and tree canopy expansion as perhaps the only strategy for addressing heat. And concerningly, given that heat is such an inequitably distributed impact of climate change, only 30% of the plans mentioned equity. And we have these sort of silos that we can observe in the planning strategies in which we have extreme heat, urban heat island, and then disparity kind of not speaking to one another, being treated separately, appearing in different documents, appearing in different clauses. So there's a real need for a more robust way to treat heat and a really more specific set of actions for addressing heat. And with that, because heat governance is in its infancy, we need to focus on new innovative ideas and evaluating them to see if those work. Here I'm just showing one example, a group that I have been affiliated with, the Arsh Rockefeller Extreme Heat Resilience Alliance, has proposed that perhaps naming heat waves would be an effective strategy. California is considering using a pilot program to rank heat waves like we might do a hurricane, so category 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These are experimental strategies. We don't know how they will work. And so it's important that evaluative frameworks are applied to these new ideas so that we can really tailor our solutions to what has an impact on the ground. And then finally, there's a need to really improve heat literacy. And so that's something else that we've been focusing on at Luskin Center. Heat, this is taken from the American Meteorology Society glossary, says that heat is a form of energy transfer and it shouldn't be used as a noun. It's confusing and controversial in its scientific meaning, right? Because heat is this process of energy transfer. And so there's a lot of sort of right now in our ways that we talk about and address heat in policy action of confusing different forms of heat. And that's important because that usually shows up as mixing different types of temperatures. So if you think of heat as this process of energy transfer, right? One thing you may have encountered, and this is sort of in the upper right-hand corner, is ambient air temperature. That's the weather that we hear on the news. So that is humidity and airflow and whatnot. And air temperature doesn't change in a very sort of, it changes very gradually over regions, right? So air temperature is not something that's going to be sort of changed at the sort of the building or site scale, but it will change over whole regions. It's more associated with sort of weather patterns. Another thing you may have seen are remote sensing imagery like this on the top left-hand corner. This is near land surface temperature. This is an estimate of the skin temperature of the Earth taken by satellites. As I mentioned before, these sort of, it's used often to describe the urban heat island, and it's driven mostly by the reflectivity of surfaces. So whether or not surfaces are absorbing and re-radiating heat quickly or slowly. And so surface temperature. And then there's surface temperature on the ground. Here you're looking at a playground up in the San Fernando Valley. Yellow is hot, purple is cool. And this is just direct measurements of the surface temperature of materials, which can actually be quite a bit hotter than the actual estimates from those satellite imagery, depending on the materials. As you see, that rubber matting is very, very, very hot. And then finally, when we're talking about people, it's important to consider something called mean radiant temperature, which is a composite indicator of the net thermal burden that a body feels because of all of the exchanges of heat with the body and the surrounding environment. And so that will include air temperature, and that will include surface temperature, but also exposure to sunlight and heat radiating off of surfaces near the body, airflow, humidity, etc. So we need to make sure we get the right measures of temperature, because when we mix them, we might be talking about solutions that are addressing the wrong type. Okay, so heat is a huge problem, and we are centering equitable solutions to extreme heat in our research center at Luskin Center. I wanted to just quickly give an overview of the multi-part research initiatives on the impacts of extreme heat on vulnerable populations that we've been doing. We have work on certain vulnerable groups like workers and pregnant mothers, low-income households, folks that live in subsidized or manufactured housing. We also have put out something called the Extreme Heat Addition to the Healthy Places Index. It's a spatial tool to help consider vulnerability indicators for California. We have work on local planning and urban design, which is mostly what I have been leading on built environment interventions. But today I'm going to be focusing on our heat policy gap analysis. This is something that we put out I guess about a year ago now. And since then, we've been following up with a series of policy briefs so that we can kind of bridge that gap from what are the gaps in the policy to what are some specific policy solutions that we could be directing towards these issues. And so the framework that we use to do this is, first we took a look at where folks are being exposed to extreme heat and who is sensitive to extreme heat. And today we're going to talk about the home, because the home is where people spend the most hours of the day. And it's also where a lot of heat sensitive populations, such as older adults or youths or infants, might potentially be gaining exposure to extreme heat. And through this framework of looking at exposure, like places of exposure and sensitive groups, we've created a framework for exploring heat policy, where we break heat policy down into different settings. So these are settings where the heat is particularly consequential. So again, today we're going to talk about residential homes, but we do hope to consider several more of these settings in the future. Okay, so the residential setting, the findings from our heat gap analysis show that the majority of the time is spent in homes. This is where older adults, infants, and those with limited mobility are particularly at risk to the effects of extreme heat. It's a problem because there's no statewide requirements for maintaining indoor temperatures at sufficiently cool levels, and we'll get a little bit more into that in a second. Air conditioning isn't mandatory for landlords to tenants like heating is. And then we have some Cal Green Code measures issues related to heat reduction, but these are voluntary, not mandatory, and they are also really aren't set up to be addressing extreme heat explicitly. So we need, even though, So we have three broad sets of recommendations. And so I'm going to start with the summary, and then we'll dive into each one of these a little bit more. So the first recommendation is to update habitability standards and residential building codes for a hotter future. The second broad recommendation is to bolster funding and the installation and use of home cooling strategies. And the third recommendation is to address policy and programming gaps to protect the most heat vulnerable populations. So what specifically does that look like? Well, in the state of California, and again, this figure comes from our policy brief, which you can find on our website if you want to take it in. At the state level, there are a couple different levers through which homes could be affected in terms of adapting to extreme heat. And one is the California Civil Code, and another is the California Health and Safety Code. And there are specific provisions in each one of those that relate to kind of what is a substandard living condition, versus what we can do with new and remodeled versus existing homes versus tenantable or rental dwellings. So it's important to take a look at the places where we can address the home setting is really bifurcated into different areas of the state's legislature in terms broken down across different tenure types: own, rent, new, existing. Okay, so our first recommendation is to update habitability standards and residential codes for a hotter future. So the California Civil Code requires rental units to have heating facilities that are maintained in good working order. That's the quote. And the California Health and Safety Code deems rental units that lack adequate heating facilities to be substandard housing. What's missing from these definitions of uninhabitable and substandard is the cooling facilities that would prevent homes from becoming too hot. So in other words, the state recognizes that we must provide heating, that there is a livable temperature condition for human beings and that it can get too cold. And this is explicitly recognized in our law, but our laws don't do the same thing for heat. And this is a huge gap because clearly there are hot and cold thresholds for livability. So we recommend first and foremost that we update these habitability standards and the residential codes so that they recognize that it's hot today and it's only going to be hotter in the future. Specifically, we can take a look at Title 24 of the California Building Standards Codes. And that one mandates that new and remodeled residential buildings be equipped with active or passive heating strategies capable of maintaining minimum indoor temperatures of 68 degrees Fahrenheit. And then if you look at Title 25, it mandates that existing rental units be capable of maintaining minimum indoor temperatures of 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, so we have these standards in place in the Building Standards Code in Title 24 and 25 for rental and new and remodeled homes, but they're only recognizing one side of the equation. So we have no parallel requirement for maximum indoor temperatures in any homes. So we recommend that we update the definition of habitability to require some sort of cooling in rental units. So first of all, amend Title 25, the California Code of Regulations, to require landlords to provide cooling to protect tenants. And this was something that was considered this year. Unfortunately, it is not going to happen this year, but we would recommend that something like that be put in place in the future. California's Extreme Heat Action Plan recommends exploring the feasibility of residential air requirements. We would support something like that as well, because there are some details to work out. Should this be something that's sort of a state level threshold? Should local communities be establishing these thresholds based on climate conditions? There are different ways to approach the problem. And one of the things that could be done is to learn from other municipal programs. So our neighbors in Palm Springs down the road in California have habitability standards, a maximum temperature threshold for tenants. Phoenix, Arizona, and Clark County, Nevada all have these in place. And so taking a look at these programs and trying to see if there are any lessons learned. We can also draw lessons from California's own laws. So we have a model in residential care facilities for the elderly where temperatures must be maintained at no higher than 85 degrees Fahrenheit. And in areas of extreme heat, the elder care facilities have to be at least 30 degrees Fahrenheit below outdoor temperatures. So we can take a look at what we already have in place in terms of thresholds and try to see if those are transferable to the home setting. A second recommendation then would be to turn away from the rentals to the owned home, single family or multifamily owned homes, and looking at establishing maximum temperatures for new and remodeled housing stock and existing rental stock. And this would be taking a look at Title 24 of the California Building Standards Codes to create an indoor temperature limit for new and remodeled homes. This should be based on public health criteria, and it should account for interactions between heat and humidity. And that would just be sort of a baseline for establishing those thresholds. I think the state can also encourage and support local municipalities to set their own maximum temperature requirements. It's certainly something that cities could be doing with the support of the state. And then once statewide temperature limits are set, local regulations would need to meet or exceed those state codes. Okay, a second kind of category of recommendations is to bolster funding for the installation and use of cooling strategies. So California has home retrofit programs, including the low income weatherization program, which could be expanded to include more options for cooling. So we're not asking necessarily for new legislation, but to take the legislation we have and really align it to recognize the problem of extreme heat. So the low-income weatherization program currently provides funding for low-income households to replace old air conditioners with more energy efficient options. And this is great, but there's no means to access funding to install air conditioners if the homes don't already have them or some sort of cooling system. So there's actually no state program currently that provides new non-replacement air conditioners or energy efficient heat pumps to vulnerable households at no cost. And this is a major gap that we recommend that the state take a look at addressing. So one thing we can do is to provide funding to the programs that are intended to address retrofitting homes. And one thing to do is to think across dwelling types. So we have single family homes, multifamily dwellings, and mobile homes. And all of these are kind of governed differently. And there are different rules and regulations associated with each type of housing stock, but the need for air conditioning is the same across them. And so we need to be thinking across all these different housing types. We can expand existing weatherization and energy efficient home retrofit programs to explicitly state that cooling strategies such as cool roofs or solar reflective walls or shade structures, and even most importantly, things like heat pumps, which are a type of energy efficient air conditioner, are included among the different types of ways that folks can be updating their homes to be ready for a changing climate. We could also establish a new home retrofit program that's explicitly designed to subsidize cooling installations in low income and heat vulnerable homes. This is sort of the low hanging fruit. There are, the lack of air conditioning in homes is certainly skewed towards those who have the least means to access new cooling infrastructure in their homes. And so we need to be starting there to address sort of the inequitable distribution of that heat adaptation option. A second recommendation here is to help Californians afford to use them. So it's one thing to put an air conditioning in a home, it's quite another thing for a household to be able to afford to run that air conditioning, especially as it gets hotter longer and more cooling will be needed to keep homes at a habitable temperature. So one thing we can do is to revise electricity rate structures to help low-income ratepayers afford to use their air conditioners and heat pumps. We can increase funding or expand access to energy rate assistance programs, such as the California Alternative Rates for Energy. And we can also increase funding for or expand access to utility debt relief programs for low-income households. So thinking through a range of strategies, basically to have a safety net for those who maybe could access air conditioning, but can't fully access cooling strategies because they don't have the financial wherewithal to be running them. And then finally, we really need to be focusing program access on frontline communities, residents living in communities where extreme heat is the most salient sort of climate related issue. So recruiting and funding community organizations can be helpful here to do targeted outreach to these populations. We need to be focusing on being culturally responsive, multilingual, and enrolling folks in these programs. And then when relevant, designing and updating the application platforms so that things like eligibility verification are easier bars to pass and intuitive for folks to access. And then finally, we can take a look again at other programs. There are programs that could be replicated and scaled, such as Empower and the Valley Clean Air Now program. Last but definitely not least, is there's a need to address policy and programming gaps. So as we sort of showed that schematic of how housing could be affected by state level legislation, and that's sort of bifurcated across different programs and titles and statutes, there are certain heat vulnerable residents. People live in places that are not captured in those regulatory structures. And so they are going to be falling through the cracks, even if everything we just talked about is put into place. So first and foremost, we have folks that are unhoused. If they don't have reliable shelter conditions in the first place, they're exposed to dangerously hot conditions. In fact, a lot of the deaths that come from extreme heat events are in the unhoused populations. And so this is a huge need to try to sort through what are the strategies that we could use to protect those folks during extreme heat events. But also, interestingly, there are different housing types that fall through the cracks. So manufactured and mobile homes really stand out. These tend to be older housing stock. They tend to be low income residents, and they're particularly vulnerable to extreme heat indoors because of their disproportionate concentration in high heat zones and a lack of insulation and cooling in the structures themselves. However, they're governed by different sets of rules and regulations and don't necessarily fall within the same sort of governance frameworks as fixed housing stock. And this is a problem because these are, on one hand, some of the most heat vulnerable housing stock types, but they also have the least amount of sort of governability in terms of what we've laid out here. And then finally, farm workers and folks residing in labor camps, they are exposed to outdoor heat chronically all day long. And then if they return to homes that lack adequate cooling at night, they never have a chance to get their core body temperatures back to a safe level. And so this becomes sort of an issue where it highlights how heat in the home is connected to heat in the workplace and what people do cumulatively throughout the day in their daily lives. And it's just really critical that at nighttime, as temperatures go down, that folks are able to get their core body temperatures down to a safe level and to recover, especially if they are going to be exposed all day long in their everyday lives in terms of labor or other things they're doing during the day. And just to really drive home this point about closing gaps, this is some research that we've done out in the East Coachella Valley. So what you're looking at here is the air temperature on a summer day, and we installed air temperature sensors inside and outside of mobile homes in the East Coachella Valley. And if you look at the blue, first of the dotted line, the top dotted line is the peak outdoor temperature that day was 44 degrees Celsius. And then the Palm Springs threshold for tenantability, as I mentioned, Palm Springs has a tenantability standard, was at 27 degrees Celsius. And so if you look at the blue line, that's mobile homes that have access to air conditioning. So an air conditioning was running in that home that day. And those homes were by and large below or at that threshold until the end of the day. In the evening, you can see that the homes became hotter than the Palm Springs threshold. But perhaps most concerningly, those that had no air conditioning, those mobile homes were too hot by Palm Springs standards all day long, and even were hotter than the outdoor temperature. So it was hotter to be in those homes than it was to be outside those homes. And this is a huge environmental justice issue because here we have predominantly agricultural workers who spend all day in the heat, come home to these mobile homes that are too hot to live in by Palm Springs standards. And down the road, we have a much wealthier community that's able to have standards in place for heat exposure. And the disparity in the geography and the exposure to hot conditions is not what's different. What's different is that one community has protection from heat and one community doesn't. So this also highlights the need for the state to set out some priorities so that these sort of disparities are not allowed to proliferate. Finally, we need to research and develop interventions for these vulnerable housing types. Heat affects residents living in under-regulated housing types like mobile homes and farm worker housing. I don't think this is quite well understood yet. And so we need to try to understand what the policy levers are that we could be using here. We also need to prevent the most vulnerable from falling through the cracks. So in important updates to the Extreme Heat Action Plan, I think we need to really think through these alternative housing types, these underregulated housing types, and these heat vulnerable frontline communities in that action plan explicitly. And finally, where people live, it may, as a sort of stopgap or a secondary measure, we need to be having options for folks to get cool if they can't get cool in their home. And one option is to use things like resilience centers for the unhoused and other vulnerable community members. So the state has allocated quite a bit of funding to launch a new community resilience center program. We think that that program will be effective only if the facility choice is community driven. If it's a joint effort between neighborhood residents, the community-based organizations and local governments, so that community members are involved and empowered to be a part of that decision making. And then also there's a need to invest in evaluation and learn from the early pilots. We can't expect to do everything right away. And so we need to identify best practices and opportunities for effective scaling so that we can move from pilot to full-scale implementation of this important stopgap measure. So in conclusion, we recommend a public health centered and equity focused approach to heat management in California to protect all residents with heat resilient housing and access to community resources. And that's going to be this three-pronged approach of updating habitability standards and residential building codes, putting funding into the installation and use of home cooling strategies, and then figuring out what to do about those frontline communities that are falling through the cracks in our current regulatory levers. As I mentioned, we have many reports that we put out at Luskin Center. We have one already that is sort of an overview of extreme heat in California. I've presented information on residential homes. I'd like to flag for you that we are in the process of producing another one on schools and daycare centers, which will be coming out soon. These reports are vetted by experts throughout the state in terms of to kind of extract their policy knowledge. And so it takes a little bit of time to release these. What you've seen today is the process of maybe a dozen meetings with different community-based organizations, stakeholder groups, legislative offices, et cetera, to try to really understand the problem in a robust way. And we hope to do that for schools and daycare centers coming up soon. And then I also just wanted to flag for everyone that, we have talked about residential homes today, but that heat exposure is not something that happens in one place. It's not a static thing that happens where people live. It's something that is a cumulative exposure. And so you could imagine during a person's daily life, they may take public transit stops or be pedestrians in streetscapes in places that are hot. They may go to workplaces, schools, and daycare centers in which they're exposed to hot conditions, get back into the public transit environment, and then back home. And so it's really critical to focus on these residential homes as one point, one node in that sort of daily life condition that is critical for overnight being able to get those core temperatures down to a safe level. So that is a public health issue. And then I just wanted to let you all know how you can access this on our website. This report is at the innovation.luskin.ucla.edu. We have also here hyperlinked Protecting California's with Heat Resilient Homes, the full text of what I have given you an overview of today. And then also, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on my email, and I can direct you to answer your questions or direct you to the most effective person to answer your question. So with that, I will be done. I will stop share and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Turner, for just an amazing talk today. And so we actually have a lot of questions and we will try to go through as much as we can. But first, I'm going to go ahead and pause so that Brooke can go ahead and stop the recording.